The wind in the valley had a voice, and it spoke of thirst. It was a low, constant moan that scoured the cracked earth, carrying the scent of dust and dry sage. This was the world of John Calderon, a man who seemed carved from the very rock and unforgiving soil of his own land. His ranch was less a testament to prosperity than to stubborn survival. A scatter of weathered buildings hunkered low against a bleached bone landscape. The sun had tanned his skin to the color of worn leather and etched deep lines around his eyes the color of a faded blue sky before a storm. He was not a man for easy smiles or idle chatter. Words were a currency he rarely spent, and his silence was as vast and imposing as the valley itself. John lived a solitary life, not out of misanthropy, but from a deep-seated weariness that had settled in his bones long ago. The ghosts of the war, of cattle drives gone wrong, of friendships buried under sudden violence, all resided within the quiet fortress of his heart. He worked from before the sun broke the horizon until long after it had bled away, his movements economical and precise. He tended his small herd of longhorns, mended fences that seemed to perpetually surrender to the elements, and drew water from a well that grew deeper and more reluctant with each passing year. But the silence in his cabin at night had become a physical presence, a hollow ache that the crackling of the hearth could no longer fill. He was getting older. The work was no less demanding. He needed a helpmate. He needed an heir. Love was a luxury he couldn't afford, a language he had forgotten how to speak. But duty, responsibility, legacy, these were concepts a man like John Calderon understood. And so, he had done what many men in his position did. He sent a letter, enclosing a modest sum, to an agency in the East. He didn't ask for beauty or poetry. His request was as stark as his land: a woman of good character, strong constitution, and a willingness to work. A woman to keep his home, warm his bed, and bear his children. Her name was Lily. Her letters, which arrived weeks later, were written in a neat, careful script on paper that seemed impossibly fine. She was from Boston, the daughter of a clerk who had passed, leaving her with no prospects and even less fortune. There was a quiet dignity in her words, a straightforwardness that appealed to John's pragmatic nature. She wrote of her ability to cook, to sew, to manage a household. There were no frivolous notions, no romantic illusions. She seemed to understand the nature of the arrangement. She was trading the suffocating poverty of a crowded city for the vast, uncertain freedom of the West. He was trading his solitude for a future. Their wedding was a transaction conducted with grim efficiency in the dusty office of a justice of the peace in the nearest town, a place called Redemption, a name that dripped with an irony no one seemed to notice. Lily stood before him in a simple, dark blue calico dress, her hands clutching a small, worn Bible. She was younger than he had imagined, with hair the color of harvested wheat pulled back in a severe bun, and wide, hazel eyes that took in everything with a startling intensity. She was not a classic beauty, but there was a clean, wholesome quality to her, a sense of untapped strength beneath her nervous exterior. John spoke his vows in a low, rough voice, the words feeling foreign and heavy on his tongue. Lily's "I do" was barely a whisper, a sound swallowed by the dry air. He placed a simple, unadorned gold band on her finger. Her hand trembled in his, her skin soft and cool against his calloused, sun-baked palm. And just like that, they were man and wife. There was no celebration, no well-wishes from a crowd of friends. There was only the awkward silence that settled between them as they climbed into his wagon for the long journey back to the ranch, to a life neither of them truly knew. The sun beat down on them relentlessly as the wagon wheels groaned over the rutted trail. Lily sat straight-backed on the hard wooden seat, her hands folded primly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the endless expanse of brown and ochre. She tried to make conversation, her voice bright and brittle, asking about the land, the cattle, the peculiar shapes of the distant mesas. John answered in monosyllables, his attention on the horses in the trail ahead, The silence would stretch between them, thick and uncomfortable, and Lily would eventually fall quiet, the hope in her eyes dimming with each passing mile. He knew he was failing at this, at being the husband she likely expected, but the machinery of casual kindness had long since rusted shut within him. They were still a half-day's ride from the ranch when the sky began to change. The brilliant, punishing blue leached away, replaced by a sickly yellow-gray haze that boiled up from the western horizon. The wind, once a steady moan, began to howl, picking up loose sand and whipping it into stinging projectiles. Sandstorm. John grunted, his first unsolicited words in over an hour. He pulled the horses to a halt, his eyes scanning the landscape. "We can't make it. Need to find shelter." Through the growing curtain of dust, he spotted it, a faint, flickering light. It was Colton's way station, a dilapidated outpost that served as a rare stop for the few travelers who dared this remote stretch of territory. It wasn't much, but it was better than being caught in the open. He urged the horses forward, their ears flattened against the rising gale. The way station was a collection of buildings clinging to life by a thread. A main cabin, a ramshackle barn, and a few smaller outbuildings, all made of sun-warped timber. The wind tore at them, shrieking through the cracks in the wood. John helped Lily down from the wagon, her bonnet ripped from her head by a sudden gust. She gasped as the sand stung her cheeks, her eyes watering. He guided her toward the main cabin, his hand firm on her elbow, a simple, protective gesture that felt more intimate than their wedding vows. He pushed open the heavy wooden door, and they stumbled inside, blinking as their eyes adjusted to the dim, lantern-lit interior. The roar of the storm was instantly muffled, replaced by the crackling of a fire in a large stone hearth. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, brewing coffee, and something else, a faint, floral scent, like pressed wildflowers. A figure rose from a chair by the fire, turning to face them, and in that moment, the world for John Calderon tilted on its axis. It was a woman. Her hair was the color of a raven's wing, unbound and falling in a wild cascade over her shoulders. Her face was heart-shaped, with high cheekbones and a full mouth that was set in a wary line. But it was her eyes that held him captive. They were a deep, startling green, like moss in a hidden canyon, and they were filled with a history that he knew intimately. They widened in recognition. A flicker of disbelief followed by a wave of something he couldn't name. "John," she breathed, her voice a low, smoky whisper that cut through the sound of the wind and the fire. He felt the muscles in his jaw tighten. His hand, still on Lily's elbow, fell away as if burned. "Rachel," he said, and the name felt like a stone in his throat. Lily looked from her husband's rigid posture to the woman by the fire. She saw the sudden, electric tension that had seized the room, a current of unspoken words and buried memories passing between them. This woman was nothing like her. Where Lily was neat and contained, this Rachel was untamed. Her dress, though clean, was worn and simple, clinging to a figure that was slender but undeniably womanly. There was a shadow of sorrow in her eyes, yet beneath it, an unyielding fire that Lily found both frightening and fascinating. "The storm brought you," Rachel said, her gaze never leaving John's face. "We needed shelter," he replied, his voice strained. He turned slightly, as if remembering his new bride. "This is my wife, Lily. We were just married." Rachel's green eyes shifted to Lily for the first time. The intensity of her stare was like a physical touch. She offered a small, hesitant smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Congratulations," she said, her tone flat, unreadable. "Welcome to the valley." Lily murmured a thank you, feeling small and out of place. The simple blue calico dress that had felt so practical now seemed childish and plain. She was acutely aware of her wind-tangled hair and the dust on her face. It was then that she noticed the whispers, A few old prospectors were huddled at a table in the corner, and their heads were bent together, their eyes darting towards Rachel with a mixture of fear and contempt. Lily caught a fragment of a sentence, a harsh whisper from one of the men. "The Black Widow of Redemption." John had told her nothing of this woman. He had told her nothing of his life before her, save for the broad, impersonal strokes of a man's history in the West. But seeing them together, Lily knew this was more than a chance encounter. This was an exhumation. The story was one John had locked away. 2 years prior, a fire had swept through a small encampment of homesteaders miles from his ranch. He had been riding late and saw the glow against the night sky. He'd arrived to chaos, screaming, smoke, and the terrifying roar of consuming flames. He had pulled a woman from a burning cabin just as the roof collapsed, her clothes smoldering, her face blackened with soot. Her name was Rachel. Her husband, a man known for his quick temper and heavy hand, was nowhere to be found. He was presumed to have perished in the blaze, though no body was ever recovered. Rachel had been badly burned and was suffering from smoke inhalation. John had taken her back to his camp. He'd been on a long ride, not at the ranch, and nursed her back to health over several weeks. They had lived in close proximity, 2 solitary souls sharing a fire under a canopy of stars. He had listened to her stories, spoken in a voice hoarse from smoke and grief, of a life in the East that had soured, of a marriage that was a prison. He had shared more of himself in those weeks than he had with any other living person. Speaking of the emptiness that haunted him, a bond had been forged in the crucible of that tragedy, something quiet and deep and potent. When she was well enough, she had moved to the edge of redemption, taking up residence in an abandoned shack. And he had returned to his ranch, to his solitude. They had not seen each other since. But the town had its own version of the story. With her husband gone and no means of support, Rachel became a pariah. Whispers followed her like a shadow. They said her husband hadn't died in the fire, that he'd run off. Or worse, that she had gotten rid of him. They saw her stark, unconventional beauty, and her refusal to cower, and they twisted it into something sinister. She was a temptress, a witch who lured men to their ruin. She survived by taking on odd jobs, mending, washing, anything she could. But the town's suspicion clung to her like a shroud, isolating her completely. Now, trapped in the way station, the air crackled with that unspoken history. John seemed rooted to the spot, a man caught between 2 worlds. Rachel finally broke the spell, turning to the hearth. "There's coffee, if you'd like," she offered, her voice regaining a measure of composure. The storm looked set to last the night. The night was an exercise in agonizing tension. They sat around the fire, the 3 of them, a strange and unwilling trinity. The prospectors in the corner eventually shuffled off to their bedrolls, leaving them in a state of strained privacy. Lily tried to engage Rachel, asking polite, meaningless questions about her life at the way station. Rachel answered with a guarded civility, but her attention always seemed to be elsewhere, her gaze drifting back to John. And John was a man locked in a cage of his own making. He sat stiffly, his hands resting on his knees, his face a granite mask in the firelight. But Lily, his wife of less than a day, could see the turmoil beneath the surface. She saw the way his eyes followed Rachel as she moved, the slight tightening of his jaw when she spoke. "He's not a man for many words," Rachel said, looking at Lily directly, a strange, knowing pity in her eyes. "You'll get used to it, or you won't." The words were not unkind, yet they felt like a pronouncement, a statement from someone who held a deeper understanding of this man than Lily ever could. It was an assertion of intimacy, a quiet claim. Lily felt a prickle of a feeling she had never known before. It wasn't quite jealousy. It was a cold, creeping dread, a premonition that the simple, straightforward life she had signed up for had just become irrevocably complicated. Later, when it was clear the storm would not break, the proprietor gave them blankets, There were no separate rooms, only the common space. Rachel made a bed for herself on a cot in the far corner. John laid out 2 bedrolls for himself and Lily near the hearth, creating a small, deliberate space between them. Lily lay down, pulling the rough wool blanket up to her chin. She feigned sleep, but her senses were on high alert. The storm raged outside, a wild and violent symphony of wind and sand. But inside the cabin, the silence was more deafening. She could hear the soft crackle of the embers in the hearth, the rhythmic breathing of her new husband beside her, and the almost imperceptible sound of Rachel shifting on her cot in the darkness. At one point, she heard a soft sigh escape from John's direction. She cracked her eyelids open just enough to see he was lying on his back, staring up at the rough-hewn ceiling beams, his face illuminated by the dying glow of the fire. His expression was unguarded, lost in thought, and Lily knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that his thoughts were not of her. They were in the corner of the room, with the woman whose presence had resurrected a ghost Lily hadn't even known existed, in the dark, with the storm as their witness. The unsaid vows of the past were screaming louder than the new ones spoken that very morning. The journey back to the ranch was heavier than the one that had brought them to town. The storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean and the sky a raw, piercing blue. But the atmosphere inside the wagon was thick with the residue of the night at the way station. The name Rachel hung between them, an invisible ghost on the wagon seat. Lily no longer tried to fill the silence. She had learned in one night that her husband's quiet was not an empty space to be filled with chatter, but a crowded room full of things she did not understand. When they finally arrived, the ranch was exactly as John had described it, yet infinitely more desolate. It was a testament to one man's war against the indifference of the earth. The house was solid, built of thick timber to withstand the wind, but inside it was a fortress of masculinity. Everything was functional, scrubbed clean, but devoid of any softness. There was a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a stone hearth. It was a shelter, not a home. This, Lily understood, was her domain to change. In the first weeks, she threw herself into the task with a desperate, hopeful energy. She waged a silent war against the dust and the quiet. She aired out the stale rooms, scrubbed the floorboards until the wood gleamed, and hung simple muslin curtains she sewed by hand. She unpacked the few belongings she'd brought from Boston, a set of porcelain teacups, a silver-backed hairbrush, a book of poetry, and placed them around the cabin like tiny flags marking new territory. She planted a small vegetable garden near the well, even though John warned her the soil was unforgiving, and her hands, once soft and accustomed to indoor work, became chapped and calloused. She cooked meals that filled the small cabin with the unfamiliar scents of baking bread and simmering stew. She was fulfilling her part of the bargain. She was the woman of the house, the keeper of the flame. John observed her efforts with a detached approval. He ate the food she prepared, noted the clean floors, and said nothing. He was not a cruel man. He was simply absent. His body was there, sitting across the table from her, his presence large and solid, but his spirit was elsewhere. Lily felt like a ghost in her own marriage. The nights were the hardest. In the wide bed they shared, a chasm of cool linen separated them. He would turn to her in the darkness, performing his husbandly duty with a grim, silent efficiency that left her feeling emptier than before. It was a physical act devoid of connection, a release for him, and a confirmation of her profound isolation for her. In those moments, lying beside him while he slept, Lily would stare into the oppressive darkness and feel the full weight of the bargain she had made. She had traded one form of loneliness for another, a crowded, anonymous solitude in Boston for this vast, intimate emptiness in the West. The name Rachel was never spoken again, but her presence lingered. Lily found herself wondering about the woman with the haunted green eyes. Was she the reason for the wall around her husband's heart? Was she the ghost that occupied the space beside him in their bed? The questions festered, unanswered, in the silence. Then came the night that changed everything. A full moon hung in the ink-black sky, so bright it bleached the valley in shades of silver and gray. Sleep had become a shallow, restless state for Lily, and she was startled awake by a subtle change in the rhythm of the cabin. She lay perfectly still, listening. It was the sound of quiet movement, the soft rustle of denim, the creak of a floorboard deliberately avoided, the almost inaudible click of the cabin door latch. She held her breath, her heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She waited. A minute passed. Then, through the small window, she saw a figure move across the moonlit yard. It was John, leading his horse out of the barn, his movements practiced and furtive. He saddled the animal with a swiftness that spoke of routine, swung himself up, and rode out. Not toward the open range, but east, in the direction of the town of Redemption. A cold certainty washed over Lily, extinguishing the last embers of her hopeful denial. She knew where he was going. She did not think, she acted. Slipping out of the bed, her bare feet silent on the cool floorboards, she pulled on her dress over her nightgown and grabbed a thick woolen shawl. She didn't dare take the other horse. He would hear it. On foot, she would have to be quick. The night air was cold, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat of the day. It bit at her skin as she half ran, half stumbled across the uneven ground, keeping to the shadows of the rock formations that dotted the landscape. The moon was her guide, illuminating John's silhouette in the distance. He was not riding fast, and the sound of his horse's hoofbeats was a clear, rhythmic beacon in the immense quiet. The walk was longer than she anticipated, nearly 2 miles. Her lungs burned and her feet, clad only in thin house slippers, were scraped and sore, but a desperate, agonizing need to know propelled her forward. She had to see. She had to replace the phantom of her imagination with the starkness of reality, no matter how painful. She finally saw it, a flicker of warm, orange light at the base of a low butte, a small, solitary cabin, looking fragile and lonely against the vast, dark landscape. Rachel's home. John dismounted, tying his horse to a withered post. He didn't knock. He simply opened the door and disappeared inside. Lily's breath hitched. She crept closer, her movements as stealthy as a predator's. She circled around the side of the cabin, her back pressed against the rough timber, until she found a window. The glass was grimy, distorting the view within, but it was enough. Peering through a cleaner patch, she looked inside, and the world fell away. The cabin was sparse, even more so than her own, but a fire in the hearth cast a warm, dancing light over everything. Rachel was there, standing by the fire as if she had been waiting. She wore a simple white nightgown, her black hair a loose river down her back. John stood before her. For a long moment, they did not speak or move. They simply looked at each other, and in that shared gaze, Lily saw a universe of pain, longing, and familiarity that she had never been, and would never be, a part of. Then, slowly, as if moving through water, John reached out. He did not grab her. His hands went to her arms, his touch gentle, questioning. She leaned into him, her forehead coming to rest against his chest. His arms enveloped her, pulling her into an embrace that was so tight, so complete, it seemed as if he were trying to merge their two bodies into one, to shield her from a world of hurt. It was not the embrace of lust. Lily had seen men in Boston saloons grabbing at women with a rough, possessive hunger. This was different. This was the embrace of survivors clinging to a life raft. It was desperate, pained, and deeply, achingly intimate. He buried his face in her hair, his broad shoulders shaking with a silent, racking tremor. Rachel's hands clutched the back of his shirt, her knuckles white. Lily watched, frozen, as his large, calloused hand came up to cup the back of her head, his fingers threading through her dark hair. He tilted her head back, but he did not kiss her on the lips. He pressed his mouth to her forehead in a gesture that was less like a kiss and more like a prayer, a benediction. They stood like that for a long time, two solitary figures held together by a force as powerful and invisible as gravity, swaying slightly in the flickering firelight. It was a tableau of grief, of comfort, of a story whose beginning and middle Lily would never know. They were two halves of a whole, and she was the intruder, the stranger looking in through a dirty window pane. A pane, sharp and crystalline, pierced through Lily's shock. It was a shard of ice lodging itself in her chest, so cold it burned. This was not a simple betrayal. It was something far deeper, a bond forged in a fire she had never seen, a vow spoken in a language she didn't understand. She saw now that her marriage, her home, her entire new life was built on a fault line, and the ground beneath her feet had just crumbled away. She did not cry out. She did not bang on the door. Some primal instinct of self-preservation took over. To confront them here, in their space, would be to surrender what little ground she had. With a choked sob that she swallowed before it could make a sound, she backed away from the window. She turned and fled into the darkness. The image of their embrace burned onto the back of her eyes. The journey back was a blur of stumbling steps and blinding, silent tears. The cold she hadn't noticed on the way there now seeped into her bones, a deep, unshakable chill. When she finally reached the ranch house, it no longer looked like a home she was trying to build. It looked like a cage. She slipped back into the cold bed, curling into a tight ball, and waited for the dawn. John returned just as the first pale light was streaking the sky. He moved with the same quietness as when he'd left, undressing and sliding into bed as if he had only been out to check on the livestock. He smelled faintly of wood smoke. Lily lay facing away from him, her body rigid, feigning sleep. She did not know what to do. What could she do? She was his wife, bound by law and God, 1,000 miles from everything she had ever known. She had nowhere to go. She rose at her usual time and began the morning routine. She stoked the fire, put the coffee on to boil, and began mixing batter for pancakes. The simple, domestic tasks were an anchor in a world that had come unmoored. John came to the table, his face drawn and tired. He did not look at her. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was a screaming void. She placed a plate of pancakes in front of him. He picked up his fork. Her hands were shaking, but her voice, when it came, was shockingly steady. "Do you love her?" The fork froze halfway to his mouth. He did not look up. The question hung in the air, stark and brutal. It was not an accusation of infidelity, but a demand for the truth of his heart. A full minute passed. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the frantic beating of Lily's own heart. Slowly, he put the fork down. He raised his head, but his eyes did not meet hers. They looked at a point on the wall just past her shoulder. His jaw worked, the muscles tight. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. He gave her no answer. His silence was more devastating than any confession. A no would have been a lie she could have clung to. A yes would have been a blade she could have pulled out. But the silence was a slow, twisting knife. It was an admission of everything. He pushed his chair back, stood up, and walked out of the cabin, leaving his breakfast untouched. From that day on, a new quiet settled over the ranch. It was not the quiet of before, born of unfamiliarity and a man's reticence. This was a heavy, deliberate silence, forged from a truth that could not be spoken and could not be ignored. Lily stopped trying. The bright, hopeful energy that had fueled her efforts to make a home drained away, leaving a hollow ache. She still cooked, cleaned, and mended, but her movements were mechanical, her heart encased in a protective layer of ice. She and John coexisted, two planets in a cold, distant orbit, never touching, never speaking of the sun they both revolved around. Then, about a week later, A new element was introduced into their impossible equation. Lily was in the small corral, attempting to milk their one stubborn cow, when she heard the sound of an approaching wagon. She looked up to see a rickety cart pulled by a weary-looking mule. Holding the reins was Rachel. Lily's heart seized. Rachel brought the mule to a halt and sat for a moment, her gaze taking in the ranch, Lily, and the house. She looked as nervous as Lily felt. Finally, she climbed down, her movements graceful and sure. "Good morning," Rachel said, her voice soft. Lily could only nod, her throat too tight for words. "It gets lonely out at my place," Rachel said, not quite meeting Lily's eyes. She gestured vaguely with her hand. "Saw you have a few sheep. I know a bit about them. Thought you might use a hand sometimes to break the quiet." The excuse was flimsy, transparent, yet it was an offering, a reason, however fragile, for her to be there. Lily looked past Rachel toward the cabin where John had just emerged. He stood on the porch, watching them, his face unreadable. He did not welcome Rachel, but crucially, he did not tell her to leave. His inaction was permission. Lily looked back at Rachel. She saw the woman who held her husband's heart, but for the first time, she also saw something else, a woman as trapped and as lonely as she was. Here, in the harsh light of day, she was not a phantom or a villain. She was just a woman, standing in the dust, offering a truce. Without knowing why, Lily heard herself say, "The cow is being difficult." A small, sad smile touched Rachel's lips. "They can be—" "Let me try." And so it began. A strange, fragile connection started to form between the three of them, a bond for which there were no words. Rachel would come to the ranch 2 or 3 times a week. She and Lily would work together, their hands often brushing as they churned butter, mended clothes, or sheared the small flock of sheep. They spoke of practical things, the weather, the livestock, recipes. They never spoke of John. They never spoke of the night. John would watch them from a distance, a silent, brooding sentinel. He rarely spoke to either of them when they were together. But Lily could feel the tension in him lessen. The hard lines around his eyes softened just a fraction. It was as if their bizarre, unspoken arrangement had eased a pressure inside him that he could no longer bear alone. They had begun to orbit each other, 3 celestial bodies held in place by a powerful, unseen gravity of unspoken truths and shared, unbearable loneliness. The summer heat settled over the valley like a smothering blanket, draining the color from the sky and baking the very air until it felt thin and brittle. The days of their strange, 3-person arrangement had fallen into a rhythm, a silent dance of shared chores and carefully observed boundaries. They were a household held together by the things they did not say, but the pressure of the unspoken was building, like the heavy, humid air that precedes a thunderstorm. And then the storm came. It arrived without warning one late afternoon while Rachel was still at the ranch. The sky, which had been a pale, washed-out blue, turned the color of a deep bruise. A sudden, violent wind ripped through the valley, bending the sparse trees and kicking up clouds of red dust. Then came the rain, not a gentle shower, but a torrential downpour, hammering against the roof of the cabin like 1,000 angry fists. Lightning spiderwebbed across the sky, followed by claps of thunder so loud they shook the timber walls. It was a force of nature that dwarfed their human dramas, forcing them into the small, shared space of the cabin. "You can't go home in this," John stated, his voice a low rumble beneath the roar of the storm. It wasn't a question or an invitation, but a simple fact. Rachel stood by the window, watching the landscape dissolve into a gray, watery blur. "No," she said softly, "I can't." The evening descended quickly, the storm swallowing the daylight. Lily lit the oil lamps, their soft, golden glow pushing back against the tumultuous darkness. She prepared a simple supper of beans and cornbread, and the 3 of them sat at the small wooden table. the storm providing a constant, percussive soundtrack to their meal. The usual silence felt different tonight. It was not the tense, awkward quiet of avoidance, but a more companionable silence, a shared state of being held captive by the weather. After they had eaten, John went to a small cabinet and pulled out a dusty bottle of whiskey and 3 tin cups. He poured a generous measure into each, the amber liquid catching the lamplight. He pushed a cup toward each of the women. "It'll ward off the chill," he said, though the air in the cabin was warm and close. Lily hesitated. She had been raised in a home where hard liquor was considered a vice for fallen men. But tonight, the rules of her old life felt a world away. She looked at John, then at Rachel, and wrapped her fingers around the cup. The whiskey was harsh and fiery, and she coughed as it burned a trail down her throat. But a slow, spreading warmth followed in its wake, loosening the tight knot of anxiety in her stomach. They sat by the hearth, watching the flames lick at the logs. The whiskey worked its slow magic, sanding the sharp edges off their caution. "I remember storms like this back in Ohio," Rachel said, her voice quiet and musing, her eyes fixed on the fire. "They always made my father nervous. He'd say it was God clearing his throat." It was the first time she had ever volunteered a piece of her past so freely. Lily found herself leaning forward, hungry for the story. "You grew up in Ohio?" Rachel nodded, taking another sip of whiskey. "On a small farm. It was green there, so green it hurt your eyes after a long winter." A shadow passed over her face. "I couldn't wait to leave." The unspoken question hung in the air. Why? As if hearing it, Rachel continued, her voice losing its nostalgic softness and taking on a brittle edge. "I married young, a man named Elias. He was a handsome man, charming. He promised me the world. He promised me a new life away from the mud and the small mines of our town." She let out a short, bitter laugh that had no humor in it. "We came west. He said there was fortune to be made, but the fortune never came. And the man I married, he disappeared. In his place was someone I didn't know." She fell silent, swirling the whiskey in her cup. The fire crackled, and the rain hammered down. John sat like a statue carved from stone, his gaze locked on Rachel, his expression revealing nothing and everything. "His love," Rachel said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "was a fist. His promises were stones he threw at me when he was drunk. The world he gave me was the 4 walls of a shack and the silence after he left the room." Lily felt a cold sickness curl in her stomach. She thought of her own marriage, of its coldness and distance, and she realized with a humbling certainty that there were far worse things than a silent husband. Rachel's green eyes were dark with memory. "We had a child," she whispered, and the words seemed to be torn from her, raw and bleeding. "A little girl, Sarah. She was the only beautiful thing in that whole ugly world. She had his dark hair, but she had my eyes." A single tear traced a path down her cheek, shimmering in the firelight. "There was a fever that winter. It swept through the camp. There was no doctor, nothing to be done. She was gone in 3 days." The pain in the room was a physical entity. Lily felt her own throat tighten, her eyes burning with unshed tears. She looked at this woman, this black widow of redemption, this supposed temptress, and saw only a mother who had lost her child, a wife who had lost her hope. "Elias blamed me," Rachel continued, her voice toneless. "He said I was weak, that my milk had been poison. After that, he was a different kind of cruel, not just with his hands, but with his words. He found a way to kill me a little bit each day without ever laying a finger on me." She looked up, first at John, then at Lily. "The night of the fire. We had been fighting. He was drunk, angrier than I'd ever seen him. He was talking wild, about leaving, about finding gold in the mountains. He knocked over a lantern. I remember the smell of kerosene, the whoosh of the flame. And then, I just remember him running. Not to help me, not to put out the fire, just running. out the door and into the night. Then John came. Her gaze on John was filled with a depth of gratitude and shared history that made Lily's heart ache. They never found his body, Rachel finished, her voice flat. The town decided it was easier to believe I killed him, that I set the fire myself. It was a better story. The wicked widow. It gave them someone to hate, someone to fear. It was easier than admitting a man could just abandon his wife in a fire and vanish into the wilderness. Silence descended, heavy and profound. The story settled over them, explaining all the shadows and sorrows in Rachel's eyes. Lily looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time, and saw not a rival, but a survivor, a woman who had endured the unimaginable and was still standing. The jealousy that had simmered in Lily's heart was extinguished, replaced by a wave of empathy so powerful it felt like a physical blow. Rachel was not her enemy. She was a casualty of the same brutal, unforgiving world that had led Lily to sell herself into a loveless marriage. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin, something had broken open, clearing the air in its own way. Weeks later, the brutal rhythm of ranch life reasserted itself. The memory of that night in the storm remained, a new layer in their complex relationship. But the daily grind of survival was paramount. One afternoon, John rode out to round up a few stray cattle that had wandered into the rocky canyons to the north. He was supposed to be back by sundown. Sundown came and went. The sky turned from orange to purple to a deep, star-dusted black. A knot of anxiety began to tighten in Lily's chest. This was not like him. He was methodical, predictable. As the hours ticked by, her anxiety curdled into a cold, sharp-edged fear. It was close to midnight when she heard it, a horse, walking slowly, unsteadily. She grabbed a lantern and ran outside. It was John's horse, standing at the corral gate, its reins dragging in the dust. But the saddle was empty. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She forced it down, her mind racing. She couldn't go after him alone. On foot, in the dark. She had no idea where he had gone. There was only one person she could turn to. Saddling the other horse with frantic, clumsy hands, she rode as fast as she dared toward the light of Rachel's cabin. Rachel opened the door before she even knocked, her face pale in the moonlight. "I saw the riderless horse," she said, her voice tight with alarm. "It passed by here." There was no time for explanations or hesitations. "He went north," Lily said, her voice shaking. "Into the canyons." Without another word, Rachel grabbed a medical bag, a canteen, and a heavy cloak and saddled her mule. Together, the two women rode out into the vast, dark wilderness, two small points of light and desperate hope against the immense indifference of the night. They found him an hour later, at the bottom of a steep, shale-covered ravine. It was his horse that led them. Returning to the spot and neighing anxiously, John was lying in a heap, motionless. A rock slide, small but vicious, had taken his horse's footing. He was alive, but barely conscious. There was a nasty gash on his forehead, and when they tried to move him, he cried out, a raw, animal sound of pain that tore at the night's silence. Getting him out of that ravine and onto the back of the mule was a nightmarish ordeal. The two women, fueled by adrenaline, worked together in the flickering lantern light. They pushed, pulled, and half carried his dead weight up the treacherous slope, their muscles screaming in protest. They were no longer wife and mistress, rival and victor. They were two women fighting to save the man who formed the center of their broken world. At one point, as they struggled to secure him on the mule, Lily's hand slipped. Rachel reached out instantly, her strong, calloused fingers closing over Lily's. Their hands clasped, not by accident, not as a brief, incidental brushing of skin, but in a firm, deliberate grip of shared purpose. In that moment, a new and powerful current passed between them. It was an alliance, forged in darkness and fear. They got him back to the ranch just before dawn, their bodies aching, their clothes torn and filthy. They maneuvered him onto the bed, and the real work began. He had a fever from the head wound, and his breathing was shallow. Lily could feel the unnatural heat of several broken ribs on his left side. For the next 2 days and nights, they did not leave his side. They became a single, functioning unit of care. Lily, with her knowledge of the medicinal herbs in her garden, made poultices to draw out the fever. Rachel, with a grim pragmatism born of hard experience, set about binding his ribs with torn sheets, her hands firm and surprisingly gentle. They moved around the small cabin in a silent, synchronized ballet, fetching water, cooling his brow, forcing sips of broth between his cracked lips. They spoke only when necessary, in low, hushed tones. The world shrank to the dimensions of that room, to the sound of John's ragged breathing and the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. During the second night, exhaustion finally claimed them. John's fever had broken, and he had fallen into a deep, natural sleep. The two women sat in chairs on either side of the bed, the oil lamp casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Lily's head drooped, her body heavy with fatigue. She must have drifted off. When she awoke with a start a short time later, she found that her chair had shifted. Her head was resting on the small table beside the bed, and her hand, which had been lying on the table, was now covered by Rachel's. In their shared exhaustion, they had sought comfort in the simple, profound anchor of human touch. Rachel was asleep in her chair, her breathing soft and even, but her hand remained over Lily's, a gesture of unconscious solidarity. Lily did not pull away. She closed her eyes and let the warmth of another woman's hand soothe her own frayed spirit. And for the first time in a long time, she did not feel entirely alone. John recovered slowly. For days, he drifted in and out of a feverish haze, but the two women were a constant, unwavering presence. When he was finally lucid, his eyes clear, the first thing he saw was Lily on one side of his bed, mending one of his shirts, and Rachel on the other, reading quietly from a book. They were not speaking, but the space between them was no longer filled with tension. It was filled with a quiet, settled peace. He watched them for a long time, this strange, impossible family he had created, and he felt something shift deep within him. He saw not a problem to be solved, not a choice to be made, but a reality to be accepted. He saw the strength in Lily's quiet resilience and the fire in Rachel's survivor's soul. And he knew, with a certainty that was both a burden and a relief, that his heart was not a territory to be divided. It was a home with 2 rooms. A week later, he was on his feet, still sore but regaining his strength. Rachel was preparing to leave for the evening. Lily was at the hearth, stirring a pot of soup. John stood by the door, watching them. The setting sun cast a warm, golden light into the cabin, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He saw the way Lily glanced at Rachel, a small, almost imperceptible nod of thanks. He saw the way Rachel smiled back, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed her face. He saw the easy, practiced way they moved around each other in the small space. He had created a world with 2 suns, and somehow, instead of burning it to the ground, they had found a way to share the sky. That night, after Rachel had gone, John and Lily sat at the table in the lamplight. The silence was different now. It was full, but not heavy. He finally broke it, his voice rough with emotion. He looked directly at Lily, his eyes full of a pain that was as much for her as for himself. "Lily," he began, the name a difficult weight on his tongue. "I did you a wrong. I brought you into a life that wasn't honest." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "When I sent for you, I thought I could bury the past. I thought a good wife, a family. I thought it could make me a whole man." He looked down at his scarred, calloused hands. "But a man's heart ain't a piece of land you can just fence off. It ain't a debt you can just pay and be done with." He looked up, and his gaze was clear, direct, and utterly devastating. "I could only marry one," he said, his voice cracking. "But I gave my heart to two." The words landed, stark and final. It was the confession she had both dreaded and longed for. The truth, in all its impossible, heartbreaking clarity. Tears welled in Lily's eyes. But they were not tears of self-pity. They were tears for all of it, for his pain, for Rachel's suffering, for her own shattered dreams. She did not look away from him. She held his gaze. And in that moment, she felt a strength she never knew she possessed. She thought of her former life in Boston, where she had been given no choices at all. She thought of Rachel, branded a witch and cast out by a town that didn't understand her. She thought of the two of them, their hands clasped together in the darkness, fighting for the same man. Slowly, she shook her head. She looked toward the door, in the direction of Rachel's cabin, and then back at her husband. "We are women who were not given a choice," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with a strange, new power. "But at least," she added, her gaze unwavering, "we can choose each other." Lily's words, "We can choose each other," did not shatter the silence. They transformed it. They hung in the air of the small cabin, not as an end to a conversation, but as the foundation of a new and unspoken constitution. The old world, with its rigid rules and clear lines, had failed them all. Now, on this small, isolated patch of unforgiving land, they would have to invent a new one. The change was not immediate or dramatic. It was a slow, quiet evolution, measured in small, everyday rituals. A few days after John was fully recovered, Rachel arrived not with her mule and cart, but on foot, carrying a single carpet bag containing all her worldly possessions. No one spoke of her moving in. She simply stayed, that evening, for the first time. Lily set the table with 3 plates, 3 cups, and 3 sets of cutlery. The third setting was no longer a temporary accommodation for a visitor. It was a permanent fixture. They found a new geography around the dinner table. John remained at the head, but now Lily and Rachel sat on either side of him, 2 equal points in their strange constellation. At first, the meals were as quiet as ever, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer the heavy, brittle silence of avoidance, but a softer, more absorbent quiet of observation. They were learning each other's rhythms, the language of a tilted head or a small sigh. Life on the ranch was a relentless series of tasks, and now those tasks were shared between 3 sets of hands. A natural division of labor emerged. Lily, with her meticulous nature, took charge of the house, the garden, and the cooking, turning the stark cabin into a place of surprising comfort and warmth. Rachel, who possessed a deep, instinctual understanding of animals and the land, took over the care of the sheep and the cow, and proved to have a knack for mending the stubborn fences that were John's constant frustration. John continued his work with the cattle, but the solitary weight of it was lessened. When he rode in at dusk, bone-weary and covered in dust, he was now returning to a home, not just a shelter. The physical space between them began to shrink. At first, a casual brush of hands as they passed in the narrow space by the hearth would cause all 3 of them to flinch. A reflexive recoil from a boundary crossed, but slowly, that changed. A shared glance over a mending basket, a moment of mutual effort lifting a heavy water bucket, a hand offered to steady another on uneven ground. These small points of contact became the new grammar of their relationship. They were no longer avoiding each other. They were navigating a shared existence. John watched it all with his habitual quietness, but Lily began to see things in his eyes that she had never seen before. He would watch the 2 women as they sat on the porch in the evening, their heads bent together over a shared task, their quiet conversation a low, pleasant murmur against the backdrop of the cricket's song. A softness would come into his face, a relaxation of the hard lines around his mouth. One evening, Lily saw him smile. It was not a broad grin, but a small, slow lifting of one corner of his mouth as he watched Rachel show Lily how to properly card wool. The sight of it was so unexpected, so profound, that it made Lily's breath catch in her throat. He was not just tolerating this new life. Some part of him was being healed by it. The bond between the two women deepened in the fertile soil of their shared days. They discovered they were, in many ways, mirror images of each other, one shaped by the confines of a rigid, puritanical society, the other forged in the fires of frontier brutality. They found in each other the parts they themselves were missing. Lily's gentle calm soothed Rachel's raw, defensive edges, while Rachel's fierce pragmatism gave Lily a strength she never knew she possessed. The nights remained a complicated territory. Rachel had taken to sleeping on a pallet of blankets she made for herself by the hearth. It was an arrangement that solved the practical problem but left the emotional one hanging in the air. The big bed in the corner of the room was a symbol of a marriage that was both a reality and a fiction. Lily still slept there, beside a husband who was hers in name only. One night, a coyote pack howled close to the cabin, their cries a series of wild, lonely yips that seemed to tear at the fabric of the darkness. The sound was unsettling, primal. Lily lay awake, her heart pounding, feeling the vast, predatory emptiness of the land pressing in on her. She felt a familiar wave of desolation wash over her. Beside her, John slept soundly, a distant shore she could not reach. Unable to bear the loneliness, she slipped out of the bed. She padded silently across the floor to the hearth, where the embers still glowed a dull, pulsing red. Rachel was awake, too, sitting up on her pallet, her arms wrapped around her knees. Her face was a pale oval in the dim light, her eyes wide and dark. Lily sat down on the floor beside her without a word. They listened together as the coyote's chorus faded into the distance. The silence that followed was intimate, profound. In that moment, they were not the wife and the other woman. They were just two souls awake in the dark, seeking warmth from the same small fire. Instinctively, Lily reached out and took Rachel's hand. Rachel's fingers were cool, but her grip was firm, her hand closing around Lily's with a sense of immediate, unquestioning acceptance. They sat like that for a long time, their clasped hands resting on the rough blanket, two small points of connection against the vastness of the night. It was a simple gesture, but it was a vow of its own. It was a promise of mutual shelter. The moon of the late summer was a perfect silver dollar in the sky, flooding the valley with a light so bright it cast sharp, dark shadows. The air was warm and smelled of sage and dry earth. After supper one evening, a restlessness seemed to seize them all. The cabin, which had become their sanctuary, suddenly felt too small. "Let's ride," John said, the words abrupt in the quiet. It wasn't a question. He saddled the 3 horses, and they rode out onto the plain, moving as a single unit through the ethereal, moon-drenched landscape. They didn't speak. There was no need. The rhythmic creak of saddle leather, the soft thud of hooves on the dusty ground, the immense, listening silence of the prairie. It was a language they all understood. John led them to a small, protected cove, sheltered by a ring of ancient, weathered rocks. He built a small fire, and they sat around it, watching the flames dance and spit, their faces painted in flickering shades of orange and red. The whiskey bottle appeared, passed between them in a comfortable, familiar ritual. The fire, the whiskey, the vast, open sky above, it all worked to dissolve the last of their inhibitions. They were outside the bounds of any town, any church, any law. They were their own small, sovereign nation. Lily watched the flames, feeling a sense of peace that was so complete it was almost startling. For the first time since she left Boston, she felt truly free. She was not a mail-order bride, not a jilted wife. She was just Lily, a woman sitting under the stars, flanked by the 2 people who had become her entire world. She looked up and found Rachel watching her. There was an expression in Rachel's green eyes that she had never seen before, a look of profound tenderness, mixed with a question. The air between them grew thick, charged with all the unspoken emotions of the past months. Slowly, Rachel leaned forward. The space between them shrank, and then she kissed her. It was not a passionate kiss, not a kiss of demand. It was soft, tentative, a gentle pressing of lips against hers that tasted of whiskey and smoke and a deep, shared sorrow. It was a question, an acknowledgement, and an acceptance, all in one. It was the most honest kiss Lily had ever received. When Rachel pulled back, her eyes were shining in the firelight. She did not look away from Lily. Instead, her gaze remained locked with Lily's for a long moment, confirming the truth of what had just passed between them. Then, and only then, did she turn her head to look at John. He had not moved. He had watched the entire exchange, his face impassive in the flickering light. He met Rachel's gaze, and a long, silent conversation took place in that look. It was a look of understanding, of release, of permission. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He had seen their truth, and he was not turning away from it. The journey back to the cabin was a dream. The world seemed to have been remade in the hour they had been gone, when they entered the small, familiar room. It felt like a sacred space, a temple consecrated by the night's events. No one spoke. Words were clumsy, inadequate tools for what needed to happen now. John took the oil lamp and led the way into the single bedroom. He placed it on the small nightstand, turning the wick down until the light was a low, intimate glow that softened the hard edges of the room and cast them all in shadow. What followed was not an act, but a ritual. It was a slow, deliberate ceremony of touch and breath, a final, physical affirmation of the vows their hearts had already made. They moved with a kind of reverent grace, their hands seeking not to take, but to give, to comfort, to sanctify. Lily felt Rachel's hand find hers in the dimness, their fingers lacing together in the now familiar gesture of solidarity. She felt John's large, rough hand come to rest on her shoulder, a touch that was no longer freighted with duty, but with a deep, protective tenderness. He moved between them, a bridge connecting two shores. His touch was a benediction. He traced the line of Lily's jaw with his thumb, his gaze full of a remorse and a devotion that made her want to weep. He turned to Rachel and smoothed a strand of dark hair from her face, his eyes acknowledging the long, hard road that had led them all to this room. It was a quiet exploration, a mapping of their new world through the language of skin and bone, a hand on a cheek, fingers gently tracing the curve of a spine, the soft sound of a shared breath in the stillness. It was a plaiting of 3 separate threads into a single, strong cord, each one essential to the whole. John leaned down and kissed Lily. It was a kiss of profound gratitude, an apology for the past and a promise for the future. Then he turned and kissed Rachel, a kiss of shared history, of a bond forged in fire and grief. Now finally brought into the light, he knelt on the floor between where they sat on the edge of the bed, his head bowed. He took one of Lily's hands and one of Rachel's, holding them together in his own. When he looked up, his eyes were wet in the lamplight. "I promise," he whispered, his voice thick and raw, his gaze moving from one woman to the other. "I promise to protect you both." It was the second vow he had taken as a husband. This one was not spoken before a justice of the peace in a dusty office. It was spoken here, in the dim light of their shared home, witnessed only by the shadows and the quiet beating of their 3 hearts. It was a vow made not to God, but to them. It was the only one that mattered. The next morning, the sun rose into a world that was utterly changed and yet exactly the same. The chores still needed to be done. The cow needed to be milked. The fire needed to be stoked. Lily moved through the familiar morning rituals in a daze, her body humming with the memory of the night. No one spoke of what had happened. To put it into words would be to diminish it, to try and fit something sacred and profound into the small, clumsy box of language. As Lily stood at the stove, flipping pancakes, She felt Rachel come to stand beside her. She turned, her heart beating a little faster. She looked into Rachel's face and saw the same wonder, the same quiet certainty, reflected there. A slow smile spread across Lily's face, a smile of relief, of joy, of pure, unadulterated acceptance. Rachel smiled back, her green eyes soft. "It was real," she said, her voice a low whisper, meant only for Lily. "Last night was real." For a time, their small ranch was an island, a self-contained world governed by its own quiet truths. The seasons began to turn, the brutal heat of summer mellowing into the golden languor of autumn. A fragile, precious peace settled over the three of them. But the world beyond their fences had not forgotten them, and an island cannot remain hidden from the tide forever. The whispers began in redemption, a slow poison seeping into the town's bloodstream. It started with the storekeeper, a man with eyes as small and hard as pebbles, who noticed John Calderon was now buying flour and salt in quantities too large for just 2 people. It was fueled by a prospector who, riding past the ranch at dusk, swore he saw the silhouettes of 2 women moving in the lamplight of the cabin window. The story grew, fed by the town's long-standing suspicion of the Black Widow and the unsettling enigma of the silent, imposing rancher. John Calderon, they whispered over beer in the saloon and over sewing baskets in their parlors, was living in sin with 2 women, one his wife and the other is what? The word they used was always spat, never simply spoken. The peace was shattered one Tuesday afternoon. A black buggy, stark and funereal against the landscape, rolled up the path to the cabin. The man who stepped out was tall and thin, dressed in a severe black suit that seemed to suck the very light from the air around him. It was the Reverend Miller, a man whose faith was a hard, sharp-edged stone he used to build walls and pass judgment. John met him on the porch, his body a silent, immovable barrier before the door. Lily and Rachel stood just inside, watching through the open doorway, their hands finding each other's in a shared, instinctive gesture. "Mr. Calderon," the preacher began, his voice devoid of warmth. "I have come as a servant of the Lord. The town is rife with talk of an abomination at this ranch. They speak of a life of flagrant, unholy sin." John's face was impassive. "The town can talk itself hoarse. It's no concern of mine." "It is a concern of God's," the Reverend's voice rose, ringing with zealous fervor. "You have taken a wife, a sacrament before the eyes of the Almighty. Yet you harbor a woman of ill repute under the same roof. You are living in a state of grotesque indecency. You must answer for this, man. You must cast out the harlot and beg forgiveness for your soul." The word harlot struck the air like a whip. Inside the cabin, Rachel flinched as if physically struck, and Lily's grip on her hand tightened fiercely. John did not move a muscle, but a dangerous stillness settled over him. "You are on my land, Reverend," John said, his voice a low, cold rumble. "The only soul I have to answer to is my own. The people in this house are my family. That is all you need to know." "This is not a family. It is a den of iniquity," the preacher insisted, his face flushed with righteous anger. "I am commanding you, in the name of God, to repent, to cleanse this house of its filth." "And I am telling you," John said, taking a single, deliberate step forward, "to get off my property before I forget you're a man of the cloth." The threat, though spoken quietly, was absolute. The Reverend Miller, faced with a conviction as hard and unyielding as his own, finally faltered. He sputtered, his eyes darting from John's granite face to the 2 women standing defiantly together in the doorway. He saw no shame, no fear. He saw only a united front, with a final, damning glare. He turned, climbed back into his buggy, and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and righteous indignation in his wake. The visit was a declaration of war. The first battle was 3 days later. Rachel had taken the wagon to a neighboring, more isolated ranch to trade some of their cheese and wool for winter preserves, a trip designed to avoid the hostile eyes of redemption. The journey there was uneventful. It was on the way back, on a lonely stretch of road, that they were waiting for her. She never saw their faces. They were masked, 4 or 5 of them, emerging from the rocks like specters. They dragged her from the wagon, their hands rough and brutal. She fought, a wildcat cornered, but there were too many of them. They held her down in the dust. One of them produced a hunting knife, not to cut her skin, but to slash her dress from hem to neckline, leaving her humiliated in her undergarments. Another took a pair of shears, the kind used for sheep, and hacked at her beautiful, raven black hair, leaving it in ragged, brutalized clumps. They did not speak, save for one word, grunted by one of the men as he threw her own shorn hair in her face. "Witch!" They left her there, sobbing and shivering in the dirt. It took her an hour to summon the strength to climb back into the wagon and guide the mule home. John and Lily saw the wagon coming, moving at a torturously slow pace. They ran out to meet it. The sight of Rachel, huddled on the seat, clutching the remnants of her dress to her body, her hair a butchered mess, stopped John in his tracks as if he'd run into a wall. A terrible, guttural sound was torn from his throat. Lily was the first to reach her, climbing onto the wagon and wrapping her own shawl around Rachel's trembling shoulders, murmuring soft, soothing words as she helped her down. As John lifted her into his arms, his touch as gentle as if she were made of glass, his eyes fell upon the ranch. There, on the side of the sheep pen, painted in large, crude letters of dripping red paint, was a single word: witch. A change came over John Calderon. The quiet, stoic man receded, and in his place was something cold, ancient, and lethal. The grief on his face was replaced by a rage so pure and white-hot it seemed to radiate from him in waves. He carried Rachel inside and laid her gently on the bed. He looked at Lily, his eyes the color of a stormy sky. "Care for her," he commanded, his voice a blade of ice. He turned and strode out of the cabin. He did not saddle his horse. He simply threw a bridle on it and leaped onto its bare back. He rode toward redemption not with the speed of hot-headed anger, but with the relentless, terrifying pace of a man going to his own hanging, or to enact a judgment older than law. He found the Reverend Miller preaching to a small crowd on the steps of the church. The town sheriff, a paunchy, indecisive man named Thompson, was there, listening piously. John rode his horse directly into the small assembly. Scattering people like chickens, he reined the animal to a halt before the preacher. "This is your work," John said, his voice cutting through the crowd's shocked silence. "I preach the word of God," Miller blustered, trying to regain his composure. "I condemn sin." "You condemn women," John shot back, his eyes burning. "You give cowards in masks a reason to do your dirty work. You point a finger and call it righteousness." "What is the meaning of this, Calderon?" Sheriff Thompson demanded, stepping forward, his hand resting self-consciously on the butt of his pistol. "You're disrupting the peace." "The peace?" John's laugh was a harsh, terrifying sound. "There is no peace, not after what was done today. A woman was assaulted on a public road. My property was defaced. Was that the word of God, Sheriff? Or was it a crime you're too afraid to investigate?" The crowd murmured, their faces a mixture of fear and guilt. No one would meet John's eyes. "Now, you listen to me," John said, his voice dropping, yet carrying to every corner of the street. He looked from the sheriff to the preacher, and then to the faces in the crowd. "The women at my ranch are under my protection. They are not witches. They are not harlots. They are my family." He let the word hang in the air, a gauntlet thrown at their feet. "If any man in this town so much as looks at them wrong again, he will not have to answer to God. He will answer to me." He held their gazes for a long, charged moment, a lone man defying an entire town. Then he turned his horse and rode away, leaving a stunned, shamed silence in his wake. Back at the ranch, Lily had tended to Rachel. She had helped her bathe, cleaning the dust and grime from her skin, and dressed her in one of her own soft nightgowns. She had sat by the bed, combing what was left of Rachel's hair, her touch gentle and steady. But no amount of care could erase the violation, the deep, spiritual wound that had been inflicted. Rachel lay silent, her eyes staring at the ceiling, her spirit seemingly extinguished. When John returned, Lily met him on the porch. He looked at her, his rage spent, leaving behind a deep, weary sorrow. "They will not stop," Lily said, her voice quiet but firm. It was not a question. "No," he said, "they won't." Lily nodded slowly. Then she turned and went back inside the cabin. She returned a moment later holding her sewing scissors. Before John could ask what she was doing, she raised the shears to her own long, wheat-colored hair, which she had always worn in a neat, respectable bun. Snip. The first lock fell to the floor of the porch. John stared, his eyes wide with disbelief. Snip, snip. She did not weep. Her movements were steady, deliberate. She cut her hair with a brutal, almost savage precision, shearing it away until it was as short and ragged as Rachel's. It was an act of shocking defiance, a visible, visceral rejection of the world that had condemned them. She was shedding the last vestiges of the proper Boston woman she had once been. When she was finished, she let the scissors fall from her hand. She looked at John, her face pale but her hazel eyes blazing with a fire he had never seen there before. Then she went to the bedroom doorway. "Rachel," she said softly. Rachel, who had not moved for hours, slowly turned her head. Her eyes widened as she saw Lily. Lily walked to the bed and held out her hand. "Come," she said, hesitantly. Rachel took her hand and allowed Lily to lead her to the porch. The two women stood there in the fading light, their hair shorn, their faces pale but resolute. They stood before John, before the hostile world, and they held each other's hands. It was a silent, powerful declaration. "We are one. Your violence against her is violence against me. We will not be broken. We will not be divided." The town's answer was swift and absolute. John's speech had not shamed them. It had galvanized their hatred. They began a systematic campaign to starve the ranch out. When John went to the general store, the owner declared he was sold out of everything he needed. The blacksmith was suddenly too busy to shoe his horses. No one would buy his cattle. They were utterly, completely ostracized. Winter came early that year, with a bitter, biting wind that swept down from the mountains. They were cut off, an island under siege. They survived on what they had stored, on the few vegetables Lily had managed to grow, and on the meat John could hunt. The days grew short and dark, and the walls of the cabin felt as if they were closing in. The world's final assault came not from men, but from the sky. A blizzard descended on the valley, a swirling vortex of white that buried the landscape and imprisoned them in the cabin for days. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and the cold was a physical, malevolent presence. It was in the heart of this storm that Rachel began to cough. At first, it was a small, dry hack, but within a day, it had descended deep into her chest, becoming a wet, rattling sound that terrified them all. Her skin was hot to the touch, her breathing shallow and labored. Pneumonia, in the dead of winter, with no doctor and no medicine. It was a death sentence. Lily and John fought it with everything they had. They kept the fire roaring, piled blankets on her, and tried to force warm broth down her throat. Lily sat by her side day and night, bathing her forehead with snow-melted water, her heart constricting with every ragged breath Rachel took. She saw not the other woman, but her friend, her sister, her other half, and she was losing her. On the third night of the storm, Rachel's breathing became a faint, desperate rasp. Her lips were blue, her eyes glassy and unfocused. She was slipping away. Lily knelt by the bed, sobbing, her face buried in the blankets, her shoulders shaking with a grief so profound it felt like it was tearing her apart. John stood frozen, watching the woman he loved die, his strength, his rage, all of it useless against this invisible enemy. He looked at Lily, weeping for Rachel, and the last of the walls around his heart crumbled into dust. He sank to his knees on the other side of the bed. He took Rachel's limp, cold hand in his own, pressing it to his cheek. Her skin was terrifyingly cool. "Rachel," he whispered, his voice a raw, broken thing. He leaned close to her ear, as if his words alone could be an anchor to keep her from drifting away. "Don't you leave me," he pleaded, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Don't you dare leave. You and me. We started in a fire. We can't end in the ice. It ain't right." He squeezed her hand, his thumb stroking her cold knuckles. He looked at her face, so still and pale in the lamplight. He had no ring. He had no church. He had nothing to offer but the raw, unvarnished truth of his heart. "Marry me, Rachel," he whispered, the words a desperate, sacred vow in the heart of the storm. "I know I can't give you my name, but I'm giving you my life. It's always been yours anyway. Just stay and be my wife." John's whispered words were a thread of warmth in the frozen heart of the storm, a desperate prayer against the howling wind and the rattling in Rachel's chest. For a long time, there was no answer, only the shallow, failing rhythm of her breath. Lily, her own tears spent, simply knelt, her hand resting on Rachel's forehead, a silent vigil of shared love and impending loss. But as with all things, the storm could not rage forever. Toward dawn on the fourth day, the wind's scream subsided to a mournful sigh, and then to a profound, exhausted silence. The world outside was buried, pristine and white, and inside the cabin, in the pre-dawn stillness, something shifted. Rachel's breathing, which had been a frantic, shallow flutter, hitched, then it deepened. A single, shuddering breath, then another. It was the sound of a body choosing to fight. When she finally opened her eyes, the fever had broken. The glassy, unfocused look was gone, replaced by a weak but lucid clarity. She saw Lily on one side of her, face pale and tear-streaked, but eyes alight with a desperate hope. She saw John on the other, his own face a wreck of exhaustion and raw emotion, still clutching her hand as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to the world. She felt the impossible weight of his whispered vow, a proposal made not in hope of a future, but as a desperate plea against the end. She could not speak, but she squeezed his hand, a faint, fluttering pressure that was, nonetheless, an answer. Her recovery was as slow and tentative as the coming of spring itself, as the great snows of the blizzard began to melt under a strengthening sun, revealing the first hints of green on the valley floor. So too did the strength begin to seep back into Rachel's limbs. The color returned to her cheeks. For weeks, Lily and John tended to her, their strange, three-person family now focused on this single, vital task. Lily brewed restorative broths and herbal teas, her touch ever gentle. John would sit by her bed for hours, sometimes speaking, sometimes in his old silence. But it was a silence that was now full of presence, a watchful, protective quiet. As Rachel grew stronger, so did the world outside their cabin seem to heal. The siege of the town began to lift, not through forgiveness or acceptance, but through the simple, inevitable erosion of time and the arrival of new concerns. A bitter dispute over water rights erupted between two of the larger ranches to the south, a conflict far more interesting and consequential to the townsfolk than the domestic arrangements of a reclusive rancher. The railroad sent a new team of surveyors, and rumors of a potential depot sparked a fever of land speculation. Redemption, like any small town, had a limited capacity for outrage, and its attention had simply moved on. The hostility did not vanish entirely, but it faded to a dull, background hum. When John next rode to the general store, the owner served him without comment, his face merely impassive instead of openly hostile. The glares on the street were fewer, replaced mostly by a deliberate, pointed ignoring of his presence. It was not acceptance. It was a truce born of indifference, and for the family on the Calderon ranch, it was more than enough. It was the breathing room they needed to build their life. That spring, as Rachel's hair began to grow back, a soft, dark halo framing her face, it became apparent that another life was also growing. Lily, who had been feeling tired and unwell for months, finally understood the cause. She was with child. The discovery sent a wave of quiet, profound joy through the cabin, cementing the foundation of their unconventional family. The future was no longer an abstract concept. It was a tangible, kicking presence. The summer was a season of gentle preparation. John worked with a renewed, purposeful energy, reinforcing the cabin and expanding the corral. Rachel and Lily sat together on the porch for hours, their hands busy sewing small garments from soft flannel, their heads bent together in quiet conversation. There was a deep, easy affection between them now, a sisterhood forged in the crucible of their shared survival. The child, this unborn mystery, belonged to all of them. When Lily's time came, it was a hot, breathless night in late August. A storm was brewing in the mountains, the air thick and electric with anticipation. There was no thought of fetching a doctor. Even if one would have come, there was only Rachel. She was a rock, the woman who had lost her own child, who had been branded a witch and an outcast, became a figure of supreme, calming competence. She sent John out to pace and boil water, taking complete charge of the birthing room. She held Lily's hand, wiped her brow, and spoke to her in a low, steady voice, her words a lifeline through the waves of pain. She was not just a midwife. She was a conduit of strength, pouring her own resilience and love into the struggling body of her friend, her sister, her other wife. After hours of agonizing labor, a new life entered the world with a thin, piercing cry. It was a girl, small and perfect, with a shock of dark hair. As Rachel cleaned the infant and wrapped her in a blanket, a look of awe on her face, Lily gave another, sharper cry, not of relief but of renewed, shocking pain. Rachel's eyes widened in understanding. "John," she called, her voice sharp with an urgency that cut through his anxious pacing. "There's another one." The second baby, another girl, arrived 20 minutes later, a mirror image of the first. Twins, 2 perfect, healthy daughters. Rachel laid the firstborn in Lily's exhausted arms. Then she took the second and carried her out to John, who stood frozen in the main room, his face a mask of terror and hope. She placed the tiny, squirming bundle in his large, trembling hands. He looked down at the miniature face, at the impossibly small fingers curled into a fist, and the hard, stoic rancher John Calderon finally broke. A single, heavy tear fell from his eye and landed on the baby's cheek. They were a family, complete. They named the firstborn Sarah, after the daughter Rachel had lost, a tribute that was a quiet, shared acknowledgement of a grief that was now part of their collective history. The second they named Abigail, after Lily's older sister, the only person from her past life she had ever truly loved. Sarah and Abigail, one name for the past that had been lost, one for the past that had been left behind, both names for the future they would now build together. Life with 2 infants was a chaotic, exhausting, beautiful blur. The lines between them, already soft, dissolved completely. Their days were a shared rhythm of feeding, washing, and soothing. Their nights were a tangle of shared beds and shared duties, one of them walking a crying baby while the other 2 slept, taking turns without a word needing to be spoken. John, the silent, brooding man, discovered a well of tenderness within himself he never knew he possessed. He would sit for hours by the fire, a baby asleep on his broad chest, his large, calloused finger held tight in a tiny hand. The ranch flourished under their shared care. They were no longer just surviving. They were building. They lived as a married trio in every sense of the word. They shared their labor, their meals, their bed, their children, and their love. There was no word for what they were in the language of the outside world, but in the quiet confines of the ranch, their life had its own perfect, unassailable logic. One day in the autumn, John took the wagon and rode out toward Rachel's old, abandoned shack. He returned not with salvaged timber, but with new, clean-smelling lumber from a mill far to the north, a place where his name and his story were unknown. For weeks, he worked on the old site. He did not simply repair the old shack. He dismantled it, saving only the hearthstones, and built a new, larger cabin in its place. It was beautifully made, with a tight-fitting door, a wide window that faced the setting sun, and a hearth built from the original stones. When it was finished, he led them both to it. It was not furnished like a home, but with a single, large bed covered in the finest woolen blankets he had been able to trade for, and two simple chairs before the fire. "This is not my house or your old one," he said, looking from Rachel to Lily. "This is ours." It became their sanctuary, a place of ritual. Most nights, they all slept together in the main house, a warm, chaotic jumble of parents and children. But every Saturday, after the girls were asleep, they would walk hand in hand to the small cabin. It was their time, a time to remember the vows spoken in whispers, to reconnect in the quiet, away from the endless demands of the ranch and the children. It was a space consecrated to the unique, three-souled love that bound them together. The years passed. The girls grew from infants to toddlers, their laughter filling the quiet valley. Sarah had Rachel's fierce, green-eyed stare and John's quiet stubbornness. Abigail had Lily's gentle hazel eyes and her warm, easy smile. They were a perfect fusion of the three people who loved them. One evening, as the sun began its slow, magnificent descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, the three of them sat on the porch, watching the girls play in the dust. A comfortable, familiar silence enveloped them. The hard years, the fear, the judgment of the world, it all seemed a lifetime away. They had weathered the storms, both inside and out. They had survived. John sat in the middle, a solid, steadfast anchor. He looked at his daughters, their hair glowing in the golden light, and a slow, genuine smile creased the corners of his eyes. He reached out his left hand, and Lily took it, her fingers lacing through his. He reached out his right, and Rachel's hand found his, her grip firm and sure. They sat there, the three of them, bound together, watching the last of the sun bleed away below the horizon. They looked out over the vast, empty land that they had filled with a life and a love that was entirely their own. There were no more words that needed to be said. There were no more vows that needed to be spoken. Here, on this small patch of earth, under the wide and silent sky, they were simply living them. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We're curious, where in the world are you listening from? Let us know in the comments below so we can all connect. Please consider subscribing to the From Wild West channel and be sure to share your thoughts on John, Lily, and Rachel's journey.